Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. This week's episode is our year-end wrap-up, where we look back at the big inflection points and emerging trends in immigration from this past year. To do that, we welcome an all-star group of reporters: Ellen Gilmer, Senior Homeland Security Reporter for Bloomberg News, who covers federal policy and congressional action on immigration and homeland security issues, as well as DHS and its agencies, and tweets at Ellen Gilmer; Camilo Montoya-Galvez, reporter at CBS News, who covers immigration and tweets at Camilo Reports; and Michelle Hackman, reporter at The Wall Street Journal, who covers immigration policy and DHS and tweets at @Hackman. We are also joined by our very own Theresa Cardinal Brown. An exciting episode ahead, so stick around. Welcome, Ellen, Michelle, Camilo, and Theresa. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you for having us.
I'm excited to be here.
So before we delve into our year-end wrap-up, let's start with the news that has the immigration world abuzz. There have been reports over the last few days that Senators Sinema and Tillis are working on a framework for immigration reform, which would provide legal status for Dreamers, funding for border security, an extension of Title 42, and an overhaul of the asylum system, among a few other provisions. So would love to hear what you all are hearing about this and how much there is there.
So this is another, high drama, 11th hour, will they, won't they, immigration fight that I think everybody in the immigration space is very familiar with. And I would say, based on the time left in this Congress, the odds of something passing are low. At the same time, though, you have Senator Sinema involved in this, who has a very strong history of brokering deals that are hard to broker between parties. So I wouldn't count them out just yet, but they don't even have text. They don't have agreement on all their issues. They certainly don't have enough people who have signed on to support it. At this point, nobody is giving a position on it because they don't know, what the specifics are.
Just to add to that, the thing I've thought about is, we have just a few weeks left in this session, but there does come a point when the issue of Dreamers becomes more urgent, particularly if the Supreme Court rules on DACA, potentially strikes down DACA. And I think with this sort of thing, when you have a deal cemented that a certain number of people have agreed to, even if it is not something that's acted on immediately, it can be something that comes back in a few years and is suddenly a blueprint, when the time is more right.
Yeah, and I mean, in addition to the fact that, as Michelle mentioned, DACA could very well come again under legal jeopardy next year, this, new round of talks in Congress is inherently connected to the potential end of Title 42 on December 21st. But then again, like what happened earlier this year, there is the possibility that Title 42 does not end as planned on December 21st. There's still the possibility that the Justice Department could appeal. We also have a group of Republican-led states filing a motion to defend Title 42 in court. So I think that the outcome of that case will determine a lot of these talks and how they proceed. So I think that's something that we definitely have to monitor.
Okay, so now that we have a temperature of where the talks are, let's jump into our year-end wrap-up. We're going to start with what we at BPC think are the top immigration stories of the year, and then we'll kick it over to each of our reporters who will give their own take. So Theresa, can you start us off by giving us a top 10 list of the biggest stories in immigration this year?
So in no particular order, I think the biggest story is one we were just talking about is DACA. And this has been probably the biggest immigration story in the last few years, going back to when President Trump tried to end the program. But the real issue for DACA this year is the ruling out of Texas that said the original program was illegal. And I think most DACA recipients and immigration advocates see the writing on the wall that this program is going to end. And so that puts a heightened sense of urgency to a lot of people to find a solution here. And I think that's one of the things that's driving these, lame duck negotiations. Paired with that is the other issue we were talking about, the border. Border numbers in the last fiscal year were over 2 million encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border. We've reported that extensively here on on this Week in Immigration. The border numbers in fiscal 22 were over 2 million encounters at the border. We've reported on that extensively at the Bipartisan Policy Center and talked about it a lot on This Week in Immigration. But it's significant. It is a high watermark. And it is beneath those numbers, as we've also reported on, significant shifts in the type of migration that we are seeing. Migration from countries all around the world, not just from Central America or Mexico. The increase in the large number of increase in Haitians and Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Cubans, the Ukrainians who arrived to the border, Russians, Indians, and the fact that even with Title 42 still in place and other efforts by the Biden administration, it doesn't seem that there's any handle on what's happening there, which leads into item number 3 on our list, which is Title 42. And of course, this is a policy that was started in March 2020 under the Trump administration, March 2020 under the Trump administration, but was continued by the Biden administration much longer than, first of all, immigration advocates had hoped. But I think even some members of his own administration thought they would be keeping Title 42 in place. They tried to end it earlier this spring. They were ordered by one court to keep it in place. They expanded it when they created the parole program for Venezuelans. And then, of course, the most recent court ruling that said that it is not legal from the D.C. District Court, and the ending of it tentatively in December, unless there is an appeal and an appeals court stays that decision. We already mentioned Ukrainians at the border, and of course we couldn't talk about the immigration stories of the year without talking about the flight of Ukrainians from Ukraine with the invasion by Russia into Europe, but also here. And President Biden making the commitment to accept 100,000 or more Ukrainians to the United States, and the creation of the Uniting for Ukraine program, which was an expansion of what was done for the Afghans when they were evacuated, but basically allowing U.S. Private citizens and organizations to sponsor Ukrainians to come to the United States under parole. The speed with which that was put in place, the large numbers of Ukrainians who have been sponsored, the number of people involved in the United States, I think that is something that is pretty I would say somewhat new for the United States, not completely new. Parole has been used before, but I think the speed with which this was all set up was significant, and it was significant enough for the administration, as I mentioned, to use a similar set of this program for Venezuelans who are arriving at the border. So using the same template, parole program for Venezuelans who are sponsored by people in the United States who can then apply to come to the United States without having to come to the border. Related to the border, again, is the stories out of Texas and Arizona of migrants being bused from those states, from those border regions, by the governors of those states to cities in other parts of the country, particularly cities with Democratic mayors in heavily Democratic parts of the country, in part for, I think, political reasons, but also sort of making the point that cities and towns along the border have been dealing with heightened numbers of migrants coming through their small towns for years now, and wanting to see that big cities should share that burden. So buses to New York City, buses to Washington, D.C., some other buses to Chicago. And the response of the mayors of those cities, which was interesting for Democratic mayors of mainly cities that have been seen as very welcoming to immigrants, to say, hey, this isn't good. We don't have the ability to take care of these people. So I do think that there was a point that was made there, even though there was politics at play, but I think it did sort of elevate the issue for many in those locations of what's happening at the border. I think another issue that maybe went under the radar for a lot of people who don't closely follow the legal immigration system is the growing number of backlogs of cases in our legal immigration system that is pushing legislation that's being considered in Congress now. But, the backlogs in processing at USCIS have gotten so bad that they've had to basically automatically extend the validity of things as simple as a green card replacement for up to 2 years because they can't get to those cases. They have an affirmative asylum backlog that's several 100,000 cases. They barely managed to process all of the immigrant visas available in this fiscal year by processing them essentially out of order. And they're still facing very, very large backlogs. They're trying to tackle them, but they're facing very large backlogs. I think we also know of the backlogs that have been growing in the immigration court system. So as people arrive at the border and are being processed into the United States to seek asylum in immigration court, our immigration courts have reached almost 2 million cases in that backlog. And these backlogs are now causing, I would argue, the entire immigration system to just buckle under the weight. The idea that we can't process the simplest types of cases in anything close to some sort of, reasonable processing time, that we're creating workarounds of extending work authorizations or green card eligibility to people because they simply can't get to the cases. The fact that if you arrive for asylum today and are processed in the United States, you may wait 4 years or longer to have your case heard. That is also creating its own incentives to come. So I think that issue is going to be one that is going to resonate into next year in the future for sure. We've already mentioned courts, and particularly the Supreme Court being engaged in immigration again in a very big way, including major cases about the migrant protection protocols, allowing the Biden administration to terminate that. And just recently, other cases related to eligibility for asylum. They're listening to other arguments on the administration's enforcement priorities. So the litigation around various immigration issues continues full force in 2022, up to and including the Supreme Court, and I think we're gonna keep seeing that as well. I think getting down to number 9, the LA Declaration, the Los Angeles Declaration, which came out of the Summit of the Americas earlier this year, was a major, I think, step forward in the United States, especially, and by the Biden administration, recognizing the need for hemispheric cooperation on the unparalleled migration that is happening throughout the hemisphere. We talk a lot about what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border, but people are moving throughout South America, Central America, and North America right now in unprecedented numbers. You have huge numbers of displaced people throughout the hemisphere, and you have people from outside the hemisphere coming and migrating through the hemisphere as well. And it is simply not something that can be solely addressed by the United States. So the LA Declaration, I think, does mark a significant moment especially for a country that not so long ago under the Trump administration decided we would not participate in the United Nations process of the migration compact that they were working on. So I think that's an important note to mark. And last but not least, and certainly not best, this year marked what seemed to be a record number of deaths at the border. And I think that we have obviously had people dying across the U.S.-Mexico border for many, many years, but the highest number that have been recorded, and we also know that the recorded deaths are a small portion of the overall deaths. And I think that's representative not just of the desperation of migrants to try to get to the United States. It's representative of the criminal smuggling organizations that are allowing people and sometimes leaving people in those situations to die, and the fact that we haven't really been successful at managing migration so that we can reduce those number of deaths. So those are from BPC, what we see as the top 10 news stories of 2022. But I really can't wait to hear what our guests have to say about it.
Yeah, so Ellen, Michelle, and Camilo, I'm going to throw it back to you to ask what you think were the top immigration stories of the year. Do you agree with the list that Theresa laid out, or do you think that there's a story missing?
I think, Theresa, this is Michelle, you did a really good job. The one thing I would add...
I've been reading all of your stories.
The one thing I would add, and it's not a new story to 2022, but I think the continued sort of changing demographics that we're seeing at the border is really is sort of a seismic change that's affecting not only our policies at the border, but how cities are able to handle different populations. You know, for example, we're seeing a lot more Venezuelans coming to the country, a lot more Cubans. First of all, Cubans actually qualify for some number of benefits. So we've had an explosion in the benefits that we're now offering newly arrived migrants. For Venezuelans, we're seeing a higher than usual instance, where we were before this new Venezuela policy came into effect, of Venezuelans coming into the country and actually not having a place to go, which is a very new phenomenon at the border. I can let my colleagues jump in too.
No, Theresa, your list was great, and Michelle, you're making an excellent point about just the seismic change in demographics at the border, but I think I would add two items. The first one is the ongoing effort to resettle and integrate the tens of thousands of Afghans who came to the U.S. following the takeover by the Taliban back in August of 2021. Obviously, this massive operation started last year, but it's ongoing because while most of these evacuees have now joined their respective communities here in the U.S., many of them still face an uncertain legal situation here because, as you know, most of them were paroled into the country. Parole, as you all know, does not offer them a pathway to permanent status, and Congress has not yet been able to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, which does have some bipartisan support. So I think that's something that I would add, the ongoing legal uncertainty that tens of thousands of Afghan evacuees face. And I would also add the fact that the Biden administration has made several 100,000 of immigrants eligible for temporary protected status. Just recently, the Biden administration created or expanded the already existing temporary protected status program for Haitians already here in the U.S., moving up that cutoff date to make 100,000 additional Haitians eligible for the program. You know, it has also made immigrants from Venezuela, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and others eligible for the program. And I think that's something that I think we will continue to see the administration do, especially if Congress does not legalize the undocumented population here in the U.S. So I would just add those two items.
And I would add something that's really a through line through all of these stories that have been huge in 2022, which is just the Biden administration's kind of continued effort and some would say struggle to find its way on immigration, to get all its people in place. You had Ed Gonzalez, who was nominated to lead ICE, withdraw. You had Chris Magnus, who led CBP, resign. You have Secretary Mayorkas continuing to deal with quite a lot of blowback from Congress, from Republicans, but also from a lot of Democrats, which was a really tough issue for the Biden administration, particularly in the spring when it was first trying to end Title 42. So that's something that's just been continuing, and it'll be a continuing story, but I think 2022 really had some big inflection points of that kind of struggle for the administration to find its way.
So speaking of the struggle for the administration to find its way, let's dig into some of these big stories further. And one of the biggest year-end stories is the potential end of Title 42. As we've already mentioned, a D.C. federal judge blocked the administration from using the order to expel migrants in mid-November, and it's set to officially end on December 21st. There have been reports that the Biden administration is considering pretty drastic measures to prepare for the end of the policy, a multi-pronged approach of sticks and carrots that's heavy on the sticks. So, Theresa, can you explain some of the methods that the administration is considering implementing at the border and why some of them are controversial?
Yeah, so thanks to good reporting from folks like our guests, what we're hearing is that the administration is considering some policies that were actually proposed and or put in place under the Trump administration. So one of the probably most surprising is that they're considering implementing something called the transit ban, which, as the Trump administration implemented it, would say that someone is ineligible for asylum if they pass through another country and did not first apply for asylum there. There were lawsuits against that. The Biden administration did not carry that plan forward. So the fact that they're considering that is, I think, a pretty major shift from where they were when they were campaigning and they first came into office. It's certainly drawn a lot of approbation from asylum and immigrant rights organizations. I think some of the other things that we have heard them talk about are similar, asking Mexico to take back additional nationalities under expedited removal. So expedited removal is an immigration authority that allows the United States to deport people who don't have another way to stay or aren't claiming asylum if they enter between ports of entry. And it's been used since the mid-2000s for people who arrive between ports of entry, usually Mexicans. Mexico had not previously agreed to take back other nationalities under expedited removal. But since they did agree to take back other nationalities under the Migrant Protection Protocol and under Title 42, I think the administration is hoping that they might agree to continue to take back these nationals under expedited removal. They're also trying to figure out ways they might be able to expand some of the asylum processing rule that they have implemented, which allows asylum officers to consider the credible fear interview as an initial asylum application, and that can speed up adjudication if these are clearly provable cases. That's going to depend on a lot of the availability of detention space, because that's where these interviews usually are taken care of. So those are some of the things that we know that they're working on. I think they're struggling. 5 weeks is not a lot of time to set up any of this. And, it's over the holidays. We've seen that there's been some pushback from some of the other DHS personnel they've asked to go to the border to help, like federal air marshals. So I think that may be one thing that might drive the administration to consider an appeal of the ruling.
So Camilo and Michelle, you both cover the border pretty closely. How do you think the Biden administration is going to cope with the end of Title 42? And what do you think the border and border management might look like post Title 42?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, obviously, is that the administration will have to process everyone under immigration law. And as you all know, that means that if someone seeks asylum, they have to hear that case and consider that case. And while the administration has said that it will try to expand its use of expedited removal as an authority that, as Theresa mentioned, has been in place since the 1990s, expedited removal still will have a lot of limits because countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba are still limiting or outright rejecting U.S. deportation. So you have to find a way to remove these folks who are not asking for asylum or who do not establish credible fear for asylum. So I think that's something that the administration will continue to have a hard time on, trying to figure out ways to process these nationalities that are just harder to process because of the fact that their home countries generally do not accept U.S. deportations. I think Theresa mentioned the asylum officer rule, and if you look at the data, while a very small number of immigrants have been placed under that program, it's actually working as intended, right? There's like a 50% rejection rate at the initial screening stage, at the credible fear screening stage, and those folks who are not establishing credible fear are being detained and then removed from the country, and then the folks who are establishing credible fear are being released and then allowed to have a more comprehensive interview in their respective destination in the U.S., and some of them are getting decisions within months, not years. So it looks like there is some signs of potential progress there, but again, it has to be implemented at scale to have any significant, meaningful impact on the current flows we're seeing. And as we all know, the flows right now are very, very high.
I would just add to that at the border, all the headlines have been that the Biden administration is looking at Trump-era tools. this shouldn't be construed as a defense of the Biden administration, but I think, the difference in the way that they think about these things is that their rhetoric tends to be that they like to pair sort of deterrence measures with carrots, if you will. So, some of those deterrent measures might be beyond the pale for a lot of the immigrant rights activists that sort of initially supported the administration. But I think what we're going to end up seeing is sort of a smorgasbord of all these different policies, like you mentioned, potentially some kind of transit ban, potentially some kind of deal with Mexico to continue accepting, for example, Venezuelans back under some kind of expedited removal regime. But we also know the administration is looking at really expanding its parole program that it opened up to Venezuelans. I've reported that they've built out the technology to be able to accept applications from people from basically any country around the world. And so it remains to be seen how they pair these things. I mean, we could imagine some kind of situation where asylum seekers are effectively banned at the border, but some limited number of slots are available to them via parole.
And Ellen, as you mentioned, the head of CBP, Chris Magnus, recently resigned, or maybe more accurately was voluntold to resign. You covered the criticism that he received as the head of CBP. How do you think his resignation will affect the agency and border operations generally in this sort of period of flux?
I'm not sure it will have a huge impact. I think, Troy Miller, who's the acting head of CBP, is a steady leader who, has been in place for quite some time when there hasn't been a Senate-confirmed leader of the agency. So I think on a day-to-day level, things will remain the same. Zooming out a little, it's worth noting that Chris Magnus was somebody who came in with a stated mission to address culture issues within CBP. And people will disagree on whether that effort was fruitful or even really got off the ground. But it's notable that, there was somebody who was trying to do that and now there isn't. But as far as the day-to-day, Troy Miller is going to do day-to-day border operations in the way that any high-level official would. There won't be a big kind of political piece of it because he's not a Senate-confirmed political appointee.
So as this portion has made clear, courts have continued to very actively shape immigration policy in the past year. Supreme Court ruling on Remain in Mexico, this stay on Title 42, and the court war on DACA. So, Ellen, you've reported continually on efforts by immigration advocates and DACA recipients to press lawmakers to act on the issue and on the limbo that recipients have faced as their future is fought in the courts. There's been a lot of speculation that the case might go to the Supreme Court next year with a decision in 2024, with the thought being that the court would likely rule against the program. So can you talk a little bit about what that ruling would mean both practically for DACA recipients and potentially occurring right before the 2024 elections?
Sure. So all that assumes, of course, that Congress doesn't get a Dreamers deal done during the lame duck. So let's work with that assumption. And if the Supreme Court rules against Dreamers in 2024 or at any point, obviously, depending on the exact scope of the ruling and how the court approaches the case, if the court rules on the merits that this type of status is unlawful or granting this type of status in mass is unlawful, then these Dreamers are going to lose their status. They're going to lose their work authorization. They're going to have to scramble. They're, could be subject to deportation, although I wouldn't expect mass deportations. So it would be, massively harmful to this community of people. For Congress, obviously, you would see the second. You kind of think that every time one of these court rulings happens, that Congress will be like, oh my gosh, now is the time to act. But they really might behave that way if it's at the Supreme Court. So at that point, we might really see the type of urgency that's necessary to get Congress to hash out a deal. And so I would think legislative action would be much more likely at that point. But given what Congress looks like at that time, it could be a very narrow deal. It could be something like extending this kind of partial, incomplete status that DACA recipients currently have, or maybe it could be just like something for that community and not for younger dreamers who would otherwise be eligible. We don't know what that might look like. It'll be huge in the 2024 elections. It'll be huge. And it remains to be seen really how Republicans are kind of analyzing the impacts of the midterm elections and viewing their border messaging as successful or not successful. We've seen a lot of immigrants' rights advocates argue that the fact that there wasn't a big red wave in the midterms is evidence that the really hardline border messaging was a turnoff to voters. I'm not sure that's the case in all districts, obviously, and I'm not sure that's really completely borne out in the data, although obviously in specific races, I think there's a lot of evidence for that. So we'll see how hard Republicans hit border issues in 2024 and whether they feel like it's in their interest to make a deal for Dreamers.
Theresa, can you talk a little bit about the current immigration enforcement case in front of the Supreme Court right now and any implications that a ruling in favor of Texas might have?
Yeah, so this is a court case that was heard about a week and a half ago now. And it started with lawsuits filed by the state of Texas and other states against the immigration enforcement priority memos that the Biden administration, particularly Secretary Mayorkas, issued at the beginning of the Biden administration. Now, an immigration enforcement priority memo is a memorandum to the enforcement parts of DHS, in this case, particularly Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that says these are the priorities for us to utilize our power to arrest immigrants and deport them from the United States. And we want to prioritize those who are national security threats, who are public safety threats, who have committed serious crimes. They added to that list people who are threats to border security, which in general means sort of recent border crossers. And primarily what they said is that anybody else should not be a priority for us to expend a lot of resources. They also sort of said we should consider, not prosecuting cases in immigration court where we think people have equities or might be able to get relief from deportation. We should not prioritize those cases. So allowing ICE attorneys in immigration court to go along with motions to, terminate a case administratively, for example. And these are similar to the priorities that President Obama had during his administration. When President Trump came in office, his administration immediately threw out the Obama priorities and did not subsequently issue any priorities memo. And I think it was, Tom Homan who famously testified that basically all immigrants should be afraid of enforcement and there shouldn't be any sort of priority. The effect of this sort of prioritization memo is really about the government having limited resources to conduct enforcement operations. We know there's, several thousand ICE officers and agents across the country. There's, about 30,000 immigration detention beds. And we already talked about the backlogs in immigration court. So we don't have enough resources to arrest everyone who has broken immigration law and or try to put them through deportation proceedings. So every administration in one way or another exercises what's called prosecutorial discretion, which is we decide who we initiate proceedings against, who we go after to arrest. But the state of Texas basically said that this prioritization means that many, many more immigrants will be let into the country. Many of them will settle in Texas, and that will be expensive for us. And so you can't do this. So the case went through courts in Texas that enjoined the memo. It was held in abeyance, and the Supreme Court agreed to hear it pretty on an expedited basis without the underlying merits case finishing its lower court cases because they saw the importance of this. And they heard oral arguments last week. And I think the key issues here are, one, does any administration have the authority under immigration law to do this, to prioritize immigration enforcement. There's a broader question about prosecutorial discretion in any executive enforcement context, whether it's criminal law or civil law. But particularly, did the Immigration and Nationality Act mandate certain arrests and actions that the administration had to carry out? And if it did, how did that square with Congress not giving all the resources necessary to do that, right? So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it was Texas was alleging that it might have future costs related to this. So it was a kind of theoretical case that it would cost them money, and that was the ground under which they had to sue the administration. So there was questions that the Supreme Court had about whether or not that's too low a bar for a state to just randomly claim that we might have more expenditures based on, some policy. And then I think the last piece of it was sort of the ability of a lower court to completely vacate a policy. Can a lower court just say this is as if it was never issued versus enjoining enforcement of a policy? And I think those were the big cases in the court. The main issue, I think, from an immigration perspective is there has never been sufficient resources under any administration, going back as far as I think you could go back, to actually address all of the undocumented immigrants in the United States, or even to fully 100% secure the border. There's just, there never has been. And so the idea that an administration would not be able to say, this is the way we want to allocate the resources Congress gives us within the statute, doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think this should be a bipartisan issue, no matter what administration comes in, to have no ability to prioritize resources like that, or to have the ability for a state to come in based on a supposition of future costs and undo an administration policy. I think that's something that would be a very big challenge for any presidential administration moving forward.
So let's pivot a little bit to another big continuing story from this year, the war in Ukraine and the refugee crisis it touched off, the U.S. government response to the crisis, and the launch of the Uniting for Ukraine program, which was an innovative approach to bring Ukrainians to the United States using a combination of humanitarian parole and private sponsorship to allow Ukrainians to enter the country. So, Camilo, you reported very extensively on the Uniting for Ukraine process, including the period of time during which Ukrainians arrived at the southern border to request asylum. Could you talk a little bit about what reporting on this topic was like and what you think the program's success means for the future?
Yeah, well, I'll start off by just stressing how unprecedented this program was. I remember, I think during the second week after this program was launched back in April, I was astonished and extremely surprised that some of these people were telling me, the sponsors, that they were getting approved in a matter of days after submitting their application. That's something that, as Michelle and Ellen know, doesn't happen often at USCIS because of the processing delays, the bottlenecks, and the massive backlogs of applications. And this entire program is online based. All the applications are online, both for the applicant, for the sponsor, and for the beneficiary, and they're all online, and they're able to just submit everything online, and they get an approval pretty quickly. And the agency has processed tens of thousands of sponsorship applications. More than, I think, 80,000 Ukrainians have arrived under this program so far. They're allowed to stay and work here for 2 years under the parole authority. And I do think that, beyond this population, this has implications because it could allow the administration to expand private sponsorship of refugees to try to rebuild the system. As you know, under the Trump administration and because of COVID, the refugee program was completely dismantled. Refugee admissions were slashed to record lows, and the pandemic suspended admissions for some time and just really reduced the infrastructure that is here to resettle these refugees. In fiscal year 2022, for example, the administration set out to resettle 125,000 refugees, but only about 20% of those spots were used. And so I think if the administration finds a way to transition that private sponsorship model for the parole program into the refugee program. It will have some success in expanding refugee resettlement. And I think that's in the interest of everyone for these people to come here with refugee status, because they have a path to permanent status. They're eligible for benefits that Congress has made them eligible for. And again, they're counted as actual refugees. So I think that's something that I'm currently watching, this potential expansion of private sponsorship of refugees here in the U.S.
And Michelle, you wrote a story in May about how heavily this process of resettling Ukrainians depends on the kindness of private citizens who are usually strangers. Could you expand on that story a little bit and talk about the stories of generosity you saw while reporting this piece?
Yeah, so I think part of what made the Ukraine program so successful was that, Ukrainians were a really sympathetic story. And when the war broke out, there were, plenty of Americans. We saw the same phenomenon in the UK, where people were just saying, how can I help? What can I do? You saw, people, I think a bunch of Harvard students created a website where they were matching Americans with Ukrainians, with Americans sort of offering up their houses. And when this portal opened where, Americans were able to formally sponsor Ukrainians, we saw sort of random Americans who were totally disconnected from the war. Their families weren't Ukrainian, sort of signing up to host and taking total strangers into their homes. We wrote about a woman in North Carolina who had an infant child who took in a Ukrainian woman who was about her age. We wrote about a rabbi in Florida whose wife was born in Ukraine but grew up in the U.S., who exhorted his synagogue to get involved, and they brought in, I'm blanking on the numbers, and this was months ago, but at the time it was like at least 30 Ukrainian families, and I'm sure it's grown from there. And the question I was trying to pose in that story is, the government is trying to look at a broader expansion of private sponsorship for refugees, that would look somewhat similar, although not identical, to how this Ukraine program works. The question is, are people as compelled to sign up when, a huge sympathetic news event isn't going on, like the beginning of the war in Ukraine?
Well, speaking of, there was another program for Venezuelans that was loosely modeled on this process that was announced in mid-October, which created a narrow legal pathway for Venezuelans with family members in the U.S. to enter the country via sponsorship. But the program depended really heavily on the use of Title 42 as a deterrence method for those who crossed the border. So, Ellen, you reported on the launch of the program and former CBP chief Magnus's optimism about the deterrence effect that he alleged the program had had. With the end of Title 42 looming and Magnus out at CBP, what might that mean for the future of this program?
Well, DHS has said all along that if Title 42 ends, that they would like to continue the program in some form under traditional immigration authorities, Title 8, presumably expedited removal. And Secretary Mayorkas reiterated that during a recent congressional hearing. And he said, yes, we're working on that. We're talking to Mexico about it. But that's kind of a TBD at this point. And I think we'll have to wait and see kind of the breadth of contingency plans that the administration is putting together for the end of Title 42 and what specifics for Venezuela are included in that.
Let's skip down to migrant busing, which was one of the year's biggest stories. Republican governors, chiefly Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, bussed migrants to traditionally blue cities throughout the year, saying they were attempting to highlight the strain migrants placed on state resources. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis entered the fray once with a highly publicized migrant flight to Martha's Vineyard. So, Camilo, you worked on a really big piece on migrant busing for 60 Minutes, in which Theresa was featured. Can you talk about some of the revelations that came out of reporting that piece, especially the allegation that migrant documents were confiscated by border officials?
Yes, our story analyzed how the arrival of these migrants has really showcased some of the glaring issues facing our asylum system. The fact that most of these migrants didn't even have court hearings because they have not been formally placed in deportation proceedings. They were paroled at the border because it's just easier for Border Patrol to parole them instead of giving them a notice to appear in court. And they had appointments with Immigration and Customs Enforcement in New York City, but some of these appointments were years away, in 2024, even in 2025. And so the migrants did not know what to do. They didn't know how to start the asylum process. Some of the lawyers we spoke to said these migrants could actually seek asylum affirmatively with USCIS, but these migrants obviously do not know that, and they're waiting to see a judge and to get that chance. So that's one of the issues that I think we highlighted with that story. The other is the fact that local communities, city officials, nonprofits, and just everyday volunteers have really been the ones that have had to accommodate these migrants and the arrival of these buses from Texas and Arizona in Washington, D.C., Chicago, New York City, and now Philadelphia, where Texas has since expanded that effort. So I think that's very important to note. All of these people asked the federal government for more assistance, so I think that's something that we have to continue to monitor, whether FEMA and other agencies are able to help these local communities get more funding to accommodate these migrants, and whether Texas continues this operation. At the time, New York City was actually getting a lot more buses from the Democratic-led city of El Paso than from state officials in Texas, because the city of El Paso was just overwhelmed by the number of Venezuelan migrants coming to the U.S.-Mexico border. The cadence of the bus arrivals have declined since El Paso stopped that operation and since the administration started expelling Venezuelans to Mexico, but it's still something that Texas is doing by sending migrants to D.C., Chicago, New York City, and Philadelphia. So I think, again, as Theresa mentioned in the introduction to the segment, I think while this was obviously very political in nature, it has, I think, shined a broader national light on this issue and has, I think, fueled a discussion on this issue. It's something that I think has contributed to the national conversation about this issue, and hopefully it also spurs some type of congressional action to try to fix these longstanding issues. But again, as Ellen and Michelle knows, that's a pretty difficult thing for Congress to achieve. So we'll see what happens.
And Michelle, speaking of frustration with lack of federal funding, you wrote a piece on city leaders' frustration with just that. Can you talk about the differing local responses to migrant buses and how those responses may have changed over time?
Sure. So, yeah, the story you're referring to was sort of over the summer, as this busing effort had been going on for 4 or 5 months, and suddenly you saw these Democrats in cities like Washington and New York saying things that were like, I would almost say like we're a Republican fever dream, like we're overwhelmed. They sounded almost like border state governors. And it was pretty frustrating for the Biden administration. But, we sort of got into this tiff between these local and national Democrats where, the mayor of New York City was saying, the Biden administration doesn't want me to talk about this, but they're also not giving us nearly enough money or enough resources to be able to deal with, all of the people who are suddenly arriving in New York, and particularly ones that are bused or sort of landing here sort of discombobulated, don't have anywhere to go, are ending up in New York's homeless shelters. And you were seeing similar situations unfolding in Washington, Chicago. I think the state of Illinois might have even declared a state of emergency. There were things like that going on. And I think the situation has since calmed down with sort of greater involvement from FEMA and the rest of the federal government. But it did raise questions, at the time of why the administration, wasn't actually working to, there were plans under discussion to try to actually affirmatively bus more people away from the border to different cities around the country. For example, if a lot of Cubans and Venezuelans are heading to Miami, why not give them a ride so that, first of all, so that they don't take a bus by Texas and land in New York where they're not intending to go and where New York isn't expecting them.
And Ellen, can you talk a little bit about how migrant busing and the politicking around immigration issues in general has affected funding and policymaking at the federal level?
Well, sure. And I'll focus on an issue that has really become kind of an unexpected and interesting point of debate on Capitol Hill, which is what Camilo was referring to earlier. It's FEMA's heretofore low-profile emergency food and shelter program humanitarian account for migrants. So this is a program that was created a few years ago to respond to the need of basically border communities, local governments, and NGOs that were caring for migrants, recent arrivals. And so it's just, it's a FEMA grant program. File an application, you get reimbursed for qualified costs. And it has grown over the years, but let's see, in fiscal 2022, it was $150 million. People want to see it a lot bigger than that because it's not just first of all, border communities need more money. Secondly, it's not just border communities because you're seeing these busloads of migrants arriving in Denver this week, and then in all of these other cities we've talked about. So all of those cities are saying, hey, we need help, like FEMA, help us. FEMA's got limited funds. One thing FEMA has done in the past few months, even with the limited funds it has, is help people understand the application process. So it's not just border communities that know how to do this. So that's significant. This week, we reported on a document that we got a hold of from OMB to Congress saying that if there is a full year continuing resolution in the appropriations process, which is something that the administration would very much not like to see, but if there is one, they would like Congress to fund the emergency food and shelter program, the specific account for migrants within that program, at $820 million, which is huge, and shows that they are anticipating like a huge need from local governments and NGOs, or that need already exists and they want to respond to that. So that's going to be a big fight on the Hill. There are some Republicans who see the program as, a very reasonable, good governance kind of way to, help the non-governmental entities or the local governmental entities that are helping migrants. But there are other Republicans who see it as like, if we put a bunch of money in this account, it just incentivizes the Biden administration to keep doing what it's doing. So we don't want to do that. So it's already been a contentious issue in like a funding fight earlier this fall. So we can expect to see that again.
Okay, so I think in the interest of time, we'll go to our closing general questions. I'll ask you all what, in your opinion, was the most underreported story of the year in immigration.
I think the most underreported story this year in immigration, speaking from my perspective as a congressional reporter, is all the immigration news on Capitol Hill that's not, is there an immigration deal? So all of the more routine but very important stuff about appropriations battles, riders on appropriations that, are policy focused, there's a lot of action there. And it takes, somebody who's willing to kind of like sit through a bunch of boring stuff that doesn't really matter, like us congressional reporters, to get to it. But it is really important.
Well, I was going to mention, go ahead, Theresa.
I was just going to say, I spent probably 45 minutes today going through all of the titles and sections of the NDAA because there are tiny little border and immigration things in there.
I was going to add TPS, but since we already talked about it, I think the other issue that I think has been somewhat overlooked is the administration's efforts to expand legal immigration and to return legal immigration numbers to pre-pandemic levels. We're already seeing the State Department is issuing immigrant and non-immigrant visas at pre-pandemic levels. The numbers have rebounded since they obviously plummeted during the start of the pandemic and after the Trump administration enacted all those restrictions and visa bans before and after the pandemic. We're also seeing a little bit higher refugee numbers, and the administration obviously has implemented a new public charge regulation that will go into effect actually in a couple of days, I believe, on December 23rd. So I think the administration has improved some of the systems that deal with legal immigration and has expanded legal immigration in significant ways. We reported today, for example, that nearly 1 million immigrants became naturalized U.S. citizens in fiscal year 2022. The only years that number was greater was back in 2008 and 1996. So it's a big accomplishment that I don't think the administration has gotten a lot of credit for, but it's something that I think is very important for the country, that has economic and obviously political implications because U.S. citizens can vote. And so I think I would add just the administration's policies regarding legal immigration.
I had thought of this answer before Camilo talked about it, but I'm actually going to directly contradict what you just said, Camilo, and say one of the biggest overlooked stories, and I feel bad about this personally because it's something I should have been writing about a lot more than I ended up writing about it this year, are the ongoing, very extreme and serious backlogs particularly at the State Department. And I think as immigration reporters or analysts, we often sort of, I don't want to say make the mistake, but we focus on the border sort of at the expense of the immigration system that sort of most people interact with most often. And for most people around the world, the system they're interacting with is a U.S. consulate where they're coming to apply for a tourist visa or a student visa or a work visa or, any kind of thing under the sun. And right now, I mean, those processes, I don't want to say have come to a standstill, but they are extremely delayed. I mean, in places like in India, there are no appointments available in 2023. If you want to come here, to visit your family, you have to wait until 2024 to get an appointment. That is pretty unacceptable. I mean, imagine if you want to attend a wedding or a funeral or a business conference. I mean, this has just become a huge issue for the travel industry. Tourism is getting hit. Businesses are really upset. Hospitals are upset that they're not able to sort of bring in new doctors. I've spoken to people like the Mayo Clinic who are saying, our doctors have been stuck here for years, especially during the pandemic, and it's finally time for them to go home and visit their families, but they're afraid to because they might get stuck abroad. So I would love to see us, and I commit to paying more attention to that issue next year.
Does anyone want to take a stab at what might be next year's biggest story?
I would say, like it or not, congressional oversight will be just huge next year, and the House GOP majority will focus on Mayorkas. They have named him as one of their top targets. They might try to impeach him. Some people will be very serious about that. Some people will turn it into a circus. Both things can be true. It's still something we've got to pay attention to because interesting information will come out of that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think in addition to that, I think DACA will obviously be a big story next year, and whether it reaches the Supreme Court and what sort of ruling the High Court issues on that program, and whether Congress does anything to legalize this population and other Dreamers. I think another important story next year is ICE detention and whether the Biden administration starts to expand immigration detention. The administration has so far not relied on detention. It has mostly relied on programs that it calls alternatives to detention, right? The surveillance and monitoring programs to release a lot of the migrants who are seeking asylum along the border. But if Title 42 ends at some point this year or next year, it may have to detain a lot more single adults in ICE detention centers, and it may have to ask Congress for more detention funding, and that's obviously going to be criticized by some in the progressive advocacy community. So I think that's something that I think we have to monitor, and obviously the U.S. has, I think, a pretty sprawling immigration detention system, even if it's not being used to detain immigrants at the level that the Trump administration did. So I think I would add that.
At the risk of repeating what we've all talked about, I think if Title 42 does indeed go away, the response, how the administration handles the aftermath of that is probably going to dominate our time next year, whether we like it or not.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for your time. I have loved listening to your wonderful insights, and we will look for your stories next year.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody.
And that's it for our show this week. We'll be taking a holiday break for the next couple of weeks. Look for our next podcast in January, and we hope you enjoy the holiday season. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can find Theresa on Twitter at BPC_T Brown, and you can find me on Twitter at HannahETY. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler and Theresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of BPC Podcast is Lucy Manning. See you in 2023.